Okay, Test Automation Guild 2025. This is my first time speaking here. Thanks, Joe, for the opportunity and for all your hard work. And thanks, Stephanie, for your patience and help getting me through this. And thank you all in advance for coming to listen and putting up with my little rant. My talk is called Asynchronous Test Data, Better, Faster, Stronger Test Automation. All right. About me, my name is Aaron Evans. I am a test architect and QA strategy consultant with a small business. My wife and 4 kids, 3 of which are now teenagers, live with me on a farm in Montana. I work in a yurt in the woods, which is probably my greatest, albeit minor, claim to fame. It provides a great background and a conversation starter when in meetings and video conferences and stuff. But it can get cold here in the winter and hot in the summers. It's snowy outside, but I have a nice cozy fire burning in the wood stove behind me, so let's begin. All right. I've worked with a lot of different organizations, and including Microsoft, Amazon, Salesforce, and as a solution architect at Sauce Labs. I help teams develop test automation and improve QA practices. Today, I'd like to talk about an experience I had and a solution I developed, creating asynchronous test data to make test automation execute faster, reduce false failures caused by test data setup steps, and to make real failures more reproducible and easier to troubleshoot. Hence, better, faster, stronger, which was the slogan of an old TV series called The $6 Million Man, and its sequel, The Bionic Woman. All right, stop me if you've heard this before. You've got to do a login test. So you've got a couple scenarios. Successful login when you enter a valid username and password. Unsuccessful login when you enter an invalid password, right? There might be some more variations on this. What happens when you have a valid username but an invalid password? Do you let the user know or keep them guessing? Do you lock users out after so many unsuccessful login attempts? Is there an automatic timer that allows them back in after a cooldown period to stop bots but annoy real users a little less? How do you handle expired accounts? How do you reset users who forgot their password and so on? The point is that there is more variation to this than you think at first. But even more immediately important is you need to have users to test login. And not just one user, you're going to need to register a lot of different users, especially if there are a lot of different user types and a lot of different scenarios before you can even test login. So you go ahead and you register a user and then you log out, assuming you're automatically logged in when you complete registration, and then you attempt to log in with the user you just created. You could have an existing user set up and just test that user over and over again, but what if something changes and that user is no longer valid, or the user still works, but newer users don't, or someone else uses that user and changes the password on you? Or what if that user gets canceled in a previous test, or there was a bug in your test and you failed login 3 times or 5 times or whatever, and now you're locked out and your test fails? Lots of things can go wrong. So in most cases, it's best to just create your test data at the start of your test. We can do that. Now, I had some demo material and I was going to show how to run these tests, but I ran out of time recording. So bear with me. It's going to be my boring face. All right, so we need to generate test data at the start of a test. For registering users, that's not so bad. We're going to stick with that example for this discussion, though, even though it's boring and we've all done it 1,000 times, because it's easy to understand and easy to demonstrate. But there are a lot of other scenarios where setting up test data isn't so straightforward, and it's going to be different and unique for everyone, because that's what makes your software unique and why we need testers to cover all those different scenarios. In my example, I needed to register users, but they also needed to be associated with different account types. An individual developer account, a startup account that can have up to 10 users, a professional account that can have up to 100 users, and an enterprise account that can have unlimited users. Creating all those users could be a real drag. Could you imagine having to generate 100 users sequentially just to make sure that when you create that next one, the 101st user, you're prompted to upgrade to an enterprise account and you're not able to do it? Boring, but that's just the start. Different account types have different features, and we need to be able to test those different features based on that. And enterprise accounts can use a single sign-on service, which is added complexity we won't get into here. An e-commerce site may have products, prices, promotions, and discounts, for example, on top of user registration. And we need to verify those things and potentially perform data setup on those as well. I'm building a release dashboard, and once we have users, we also have to create a set of projects and define environments for those projects. And then we need to test the events that happen, such as deployments, test runs, security updates, and so forth, that trigger notifications on the dashboard. That's test data that needs to be set up in real time. So, in order to test a startup account, you not only need to create the users, you need to define a set of projects and environments and have a way to trigger some pre-recorded or canned events for them before you can check that the app is functioning correctly. Okay, rather than doing all these data setup steps at the start of each test, we want to clean up our test code a bit and get some reuse. The first thing we have to do is a setup step that creates users and does whatever else is needed, like creating an account and defining the list of projects and environments, or in an e-commerce situation, adding products and pricing to your database, as well as discounts or whatever other features you have. So you can do this before all tests, and in WebDriver IO with Mocha is how I was going to demonstrate it. You can do that very easily with a before hook. Most test runners, JUnit, NUnit, XUnit, TestNG, PyTest, etc., have comparable hooks that you can A, run something before all tests in the test run, or B, C, B, run things before each test or before an individual test. That before test, before each, before all, those scenarios make it easier to do data setup. But it's still sequential. So I can register a new user before each test and associate that user with a subscription I created for an account at the start of that test. So I can test all startup scenarios, all enterprise scenarios in individual suites, and have that account set up beforehand and only have to do it once, but still have some reliable data. By having my user registration function accept different parameters, I can reuse the code in different scenarios and create different types of users. And same for my create subscription function. Parameterized create subscription can create different subscription levels with different features and settings. So I have these reusable, configurable functions that I can run before a test starts or before all of the tests in a particular test run that have that common setup scenario. But it's still done sequentially, and you have to perform these steps at the start of each test or before the start of each test run, at least for now. So if we've separated the test data setup and the steps from the test execution and created reusable functions that create accounts, register users, and associate the user with a pre-created account, we haven't really gained anything except for reusability by refactoring our code and telling our framework to create a user at the start of a test and create accounts with subscriptions and defining, in my case, the projects and environments associated with that organization before starting the whole test run. But it still takes time, and it's not asynchronous yet. It's tempting to reuse our accounts, and we can do that to some extent, but we could create a bunch of different accounts, different subscriptions with the developer, the startup, the pro, or the enterprise level, and get some degree of reuse there. That's an option. It is asynchronous potentially, and we can recreate those or destroy them. We can destroy them and recreate them as needed so that we don't have stale data in them. But even better, we can have long-running accounts that are maybe duplicated from production with the appropriate masking and anonymized data for privacy and compliance rules. Mirroring production gives us an advantage that now we have a realistic data setup that looks like the real world. There's a lot of edge cases that only are reproducible with real world data. And some bugs just can't be anticipated until the rubber meets the road. Real users do things that we as testers, as much as we like to think we're creative, don't think of doing. So, with that data, we can query that database that's fully anonymized and find a user that matches our scenario. For instance, we might need to find a user for an enterprise account that is about to expire to see if there is a prompt to renew the subscription for admin users. Only admins should see that prompt to renew, and regular users should not. So I've got a SQL query. I can't show it. Like I said, time constraints and lack of skill with recording demos. So just imagine a SQL query here that selects a user based on those roles. The user role is admin. The subscription account type is enterprise. The subscription status is active. And the subscription end date is between now and 7 days. Use your imagination to see the results. So that's one way of getting test data that you can reuse and avoid having to do all that setup. But I think we can do better in many cases, right? When you're playing a video game and you encounter a particularly difficult spot, or after you've completed a particularly tedious part of the game, you can often create a save point, and go back and restart from there so you don't have to start over from the beginning. In testing software, we've talked about the grind of setting up users in a particular state and how that's tedious, error-prone, and slow. So why not doing it in advance? I know I'm going to need a lot of existing subscribers, and maybe I can't satisfy all the edge cases, but I can at least get some. In truth, the majority of scenarios don't need too much uniqueness in the test data, but there is a lot of test data setup. So some of my setup is done in advance by taking those abstracted setup functions and running them independently, saving those users to a test database or being able to query the actual user database, as we mentioned in the last step with production data. And now we can get clean users that don't have dirty data, although remember, dirty data sometimes is what we need to reproduce a bug. But we've got new users registered, we've got new accounts created, and they're waiting to be used, and we don't have to spend the time at the beginning of the test creating them. They've been created asynchronously in advance. So we've created a save point, right? The advantage of doing this is, well, when it's crunch time and you need tests done quickly, you've already done maybe half of the test. And you can restore from that save point again and again and keep going. Another advantage is that if you mess up, if there are environment problems while your test is running, or if your setup is flaky, it happens, there's timing issues or whatever, you don't have to worry about it during the test. Go ahead and fail a bunch of times, but when you get to that save point, you know you've made it past the cave troll, or you spent all that time mining ore for weapons or whatever, right? You have your users ready to go to start at that save point, and You can start your test at the interesting part of your quest. Find the bug, or at least verify that the rest of the system is working as normal. You don't care so much about registering a customer, entering payment info, selecting a subscription level, and so on, when what you want to test is tax calculation or discounts being applied, or whatever it is that you're testing, what you care about at that point. Because you know those other steps are solid, you've done them a million times before, and you actually have a user that has subscribed that's proved it's working. So you can go through your setup steps just like you normally do. You've abstracted that out so it's not part of the test, and you can run that function as many times as you want, and at the end, you save the data. It can be in a spreadsheet, a JSON file, a database, or whatever. And then later, you can retrieve that user and reload that particular setup data and start your test right there. All right, now we have the best of both worlds. We can reuse existing data that was created specifically for our tests that doesn't have any unexpected anomalies that might occur with cloned production data. And we can reproduce it exactly on demand and not worry about it taking up time at the start of the test or causing an error before we get what we want to test. We have data that's unique, that's unused and clean, and it fits our test scenario. So let's use it. We query for data that matches our scenario. I use MongoDB and I save users in a JSON-like format. And then I describe a JSON that looks like the user. It has those key attributes that I care about. For instance, the account type, the role, and so forth. And I don't have to worry about all those other irrelevant details, first name, last name, email address, credit card number, address, phone number, With that pre-existing user, I can log in and do exactly what I want to do to test. If I can't find a user that matches, I can still fall back on creating one on demand, and we're no worse off than we were in the first place. We let our setup scripts do the grinding ahead of time, and we get faster feedback when we run our tests because of the asynchronous test data setup. So that's the core of my message. If we've refactored our tests in a way that they can be data-driven, and we've separated test data from execution, and we're doing that setup asynchronously ahead of time, whenever we want, and we can retrieve the data we want at runtime instead of creating it at the beginning of each test, we can have faster, more reliable test automation, and we've won the battle. Not so fast. There are some gotchas and some more challenges along the way. First of all, we've got to do everything I just described, and that means adding complexity to our test scenarios and having to maintain those separate test data setup scripts. It means working with a database or file storage, worrying about connection issues, maintaining more infrastructure if you've got a database, and handling the queries needed to get the right data. If you're willing to do all that, the rewards can be great. But here are some more concerns. You need to make sure you're getting clean test data. When you get a user and make changes to it, you need to mark it as dirty or delete it. When you create application state, such as products and pricing, or projects and environments for a team, you need to reset that data when you're done and not run tests that expect a different application state at the same time. You run into the same issues you have with concurrency and parallel testing, even though, or even if, you're not doing anything in parallel. Asynchronous does not mean thread safe, I guess. Thread safe isn't the right word. But anyway, so it may mean that we need to break up our tests into smaller, more targeted suites that expect a certain amount of test data, especially for those larger things like setting up projects and environments or pricing databases, whatever. And when your application changes, you need to make sure that your test data is still valid. If your schema or your rules change for your application, you probably need to recreate any test data and throw away that old batch. In practice, I like test data to be fresh and purge and recreate it within 24 hours and always after a major deployment. If you have a deployment that you think might have breaking changes, throw out all your old pre-created test data and create some more. This can be a problem, especially because that's the time when you want fastest results as possible, right? I do a new deployment, it has breaking changes, and I want to make sure that as fast as possible that I didn't break anything. So we lose the benefit of asynchronous data in some cases. So not all scenarios can be covered by generic test data, but remember, this is designed to simplify testing and reduce the complexity of test data setup, not to make it more complex and not to cover every possible scenario. That said, there's probably a solid majority of testing that uses a fairly standard data set that can benefit from some degree of asynchronous test data setup. All right, we're doing this because test data setup is slow, tedious, and error prone. We want better, faster, stronger tests, right? Well, there are some more things we can do to achieve that. And this can apply whether we're doing it asynchronously or not. The first thing, and you've probably already thought of this, is that we don't always have to use UI automation to create test data. We might not need Selenium WebDriver or Playwright or Cypress or whatever to click through our app to register users, create accounts, configure our product database, etc. Savvy testers are already using API calls and database queries to do this. And if you can create 100 users with API calls or set the price on 100 products with an insert statement, by all means do so. You can do it asynchronously as well. What might have been a 30-minute Selenium script to create a bunch of users and accounts, which may have potential failures due to timing, blah, blah, blah. It can now be done with API call in parallel in less than 5 minutes. We have a job that runs daily and creates a bunch of random users that can be used for ad hoc manual testing by QA, developers, product owners, and other stakeholders. It publishes them to a shared spreadsheet, and anyone can grab a user from the list that meets their criteria, mark it as used so someone else doesn't use the same user, and do whatever testing, throw it away. We recreate that list every day, and some of the users are deleted. Some exist. A real-world system has existing users created over time, but we can purge it anytime, and every day we've got some sample of users created for manual testing. All right, what more can we do? Because we've saved this pre-generated test data and we have scripts that can be used to reliably reproduce it on demand, we get at least one additional benefit. We're more confident when we find bugs. It makes it easier for developers to troubleshoot an issue when the test data is documented and the process for creating that test data is documented and scripted. It also means that retesting is less tedious because our automated scripts do the boring setup for us, even when we are manually inspecting the problem later to make sure it is fixed. Contrary to the concern that generating the same test data over and over will lead to less coverage, it actually allows us to experiment with exploratory testing that we might not have done otherwise if we spent our time doing test data setup. You can try more checkout scenarios, for example, if you have a dozen users already created with payment methods set, with items already in their cart and all ready to check out. You grab that user, You test all sorts of scenarios, different taxing rules, different discount codes, whatever you need to do. By taking away the tedium, it allows you to look at something with fresh eyes and experiment more. Well, that's it. Creating test data in advance allows us to execute tests faster without having to worry about setup steps, the time involved, and it reduces possible flakiness caused by flaky automation. It ensures that we have reproducible and documented data that makes debugging issues easier. It allows us to introduce more variety into our testing when those concerns are removed. And as a side effect, it actually makes our test automation more flexible and easier to maintain because those setup steps are abstracted. Going forward, I hope to be able to make our test data setup run faster with greater parallelization using a cloud service like Sauce Labs or Lambda Test. I want to be able to recreate application state on demand and have predefined scripts that can generate those real-time events, those deployments, test runs, and environment changes to simulate those and see how the application behaves in real time in my automation. That's the biggest challenge I have currently on my project. Now, asynchronous test data can't solve all problems with test data or with test automation, and it can't be used for every scenario. But asynchronous test data helps us create better, stronger, faster test automation. Thanks. Thank you all.